conference. But from Tibetan or from the British perspective, it is a trilateral conference. We are talking about Tibet issue, and Chinese also participated. Yeah. And later, Chinese government did not ratify, they did not sign the Simla Accord. Yeah. But the British and the Tibetan government, they signed. And it created a problem of India-China border dispute today. The ROC government, they also try to, consolidate their jurisdiction over certain Tibetan areas. And from this map, you could see not just today's Tibet, but also in China, there's a Qinghai province and also Xikang province. They try to establish direct and effective rule in Tibetan areas, and not the Wuzang, but in the peripheral areas. If you match this map to the Tibetan claim of their territories in history, you'll be like this. Amdo is actually Qinghai province, and Kham is a Xikang province. Yeah. So before 1949, even Wuzang was independent, but the Chinese government, they tried to build some direct control over the areas that was considered as Tibetan territories. Another policies of ROC government is national assimilation. When Republican government being established in 1911, they knew that they could not claim to be the only Han country, and so they adopt the principle of unity of 5 nationalities. In Chinese, we call 五族共和. 5 nationalities, including Han Chinese, Manchurians, Mongols, Muslims, and then finally Tibetans. They think all 5 ethnic groups will integrate into a new Chinese nation called 中华民族. And you can see that the national flag used in ROC from 1912 to 1928, they have 5 colors. And 5 colors represent 5 different nationalities. And Tibet was represented by black color. So eventually it is, ROC's policies on Tibet or other, and also other ethnic minorities is a kind of a great Han nationalism. Still, Han Chinese play the dominant role leading the country, but they try to assimilate other ethnic minorities, including Tibet. How about Communist Party? We could roughly divide their policies on ethnic minorities into 2 phases. Before they came to power, their policy is national self-determination, 民族自决. It is based on the Soviet experience that allowed the minorities to have their own republic. But after communists came to power in 1949, they dramatically changed the policies and said no self-determination, no. Instead, they had 2 new policies. One is called national identification, 民族识别. In 1956, PRC had this policy, and they identified 55 ethnic minorities. They say that China is not a single ethnic country. It is a multinational state with 56 nations in total, and Tibetan is one of them. But if you are ethnic minorities, you could have a self-rule. So they created a concept called national regional autonomy. In Chinese, it's called 民族区域自治. Okay, these are the three major documents regarding Chinese policies on ethnic minorities, just for your reference. More detail on this. What is national identification? They say if you are ethnic minority, you could receive education in your mother tongue, and you have better employment opportunities, and in the government you have your own representation. So every Chinese citizen on their ID card, you can see it marks which ethnicity you belong to. Tibetan, yeah, it says you are Tibetan. Han Chinese, it lists you are Han Chinese. And what is a national autonomous region? They say that the ethnic minorities can rule themselves, but in fact, they create a very, top-down administrative system. That is, the autonomous governments can only deal with very local affairs, and everything else they have to listen to the central government. So right now in China, they have in total 155 autonomous areas. The top is called autonomous regions, 民族自治区, and the second is autonomous prefectures, and in the bottom there are 120 autonomous counties. So when the ethnic minorities, they reached, I think, 30% of the population in the region, they could become an autonomous area. Yeah. Okay, now what are the PRC's policies on Tibet? I personally divide it into 4 different phases. From 1950 to 1959, I think we are all familiar with, they introduced one country, 2 systems to Tibet. And after the uprising of 1959, we could see inside Tibet it was a crackdown, and later a lot of political movements, political turmoils, particularly during the Cultural Revolution. After 1976, there are around 10 years, many people think that that is the best time for Chinese and Tibet, because Hu Yaobang was in charge of Tibetan affairs. He allowed a revival of religion, revival of cultural rights. So it's kind of a rapprochement between Chinese and Tibetans. And Tibetan government also sent delegation back to Tibet during that time. But after 1989, until now, the next stage, what we see today, is that China continue tightening their control over Tibet and try to eradicate Tibetan culture, religion, and identity. This is the homepage of Tibetan government, autonomous government. You see, it's all in Chinese, okay? The local government of Tibet, but the website, homepage, is all in Chinese. And you see whose photo is on it. It's Xi Jinping. Yeah, so this is a real autonomy? I doubt. Okay, finally, a few more slides. Yeah, I did some research about China's policies on ethnic minorities. So in 2011, I had a chance to visit Zoiga County in Napa, Tibetan and Chang Autonomous Prefecture. It's in the very northwest side of Sichuan. Yeah, traditionally Amdo area. Yeah. One morning, I walked into a temple. It's called Daza Temple. Yeah. Very, very quiet outside. Yeah. I was just curious, so I just walked into the temple, and I found the inside temple is full of Tibetans. Yeah, they all sitting inside the temple praying. Yeah. And I asked my friends in China that Tibetan temples very beautiful, and many people praying inside. Yeah, why don't you want to see it? They said, no, we are not interested. You see, this is what I saw in China. That is, it's different from what I saw in Taiwan or in Dharamshala. in Taiwan, we have many Tibetan Buddhists. Yeah. And in Dharamsala and also in Taiwan, those temples, anyone could go inside and see. Yeah. And also, there are a lot of exchanges between Tibetans and people from outside. But in China, the local people just consider everything about Tibet as something, I would say, that is very different. They have no interest in knowing anything about Tibet. They don't want to learn Tibetan culture, history. They are not interested in Tibetan religion. This is very strange. I think that the Chinese government has successfully educated the people to keep distance from Tibetan culture and religion. This is a disaster. I also had a chance to visit some areas in Nagua County. This is Norman settlement policies. In Chinese, it's called 退牧换草. This is one of such village. They kind of encourage Normans to give up their land and move all of them into a village, build houses for them, and saying that kids could receive education, you have houses. But the problem is that the Tibetans, the Normans, after leaving their land, after moving into village like this, they also lose, the skills to live. So many of them don't know how to survive after they spend all the money provided by government. And the Chinese government saying that this Norman settlement policy is good for the Tibetan people in the area. But I also asked some Tibetan friends, they say no. No, actually Tibetan people do not really benefit from policies like this. But this is what they are doing in Tibet right now. Okay, so I hope my presentation will give you some ideas about how Chinese look at the Tibet and how the current government in China rule Tibet. And I personally believe that, because I'm from Taiwan, I think that to really, if we want to really make a progress, of course that we have to stand firm. But another important thing is that we try to encourage the ordinary Chinese people to know Tibet more. And in Taiwan, we have tried to do that. In Taiwan, we have about 200,000 Tibetan Buddhists. And the society shows more sympathy about Tibet issue. And all the books about Tibet written in Chinese are published in Taiwan. You don't get it published in China, not in Hong Kong, but in Taiwan. Yeah. Okay, so I hope you enjoy my presentation. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now I would like to invite Mr. Tampa Gladsen, the head of the Environment and Development Desk, Tibet Policy Institute, Central Tibetan Administration. Please.
Now, the picture that you see on the big screen is a picture of beautiful city of Riga. And like Tibet, like Riga, Tibet is also very beautiful, probably one of the most beautiful places on the planet. But the reason why I have put this picture up here is not because of the city itself, but because of the name, Riga. And for me, Riga is a very Tibetan name. It's not only a Tibetan name, but it's also a very eco-friendly name. Now, in Tibetan, Riga means love for mountains. That's right. And many of the Tibetan parliamentarians here, I'm sure that you must have noticed that. And we also have many Tibetans whose name is Riga, especially in eastern part of Tibet. Now, when we say love for mountains, it's important because Tibet Plateau is home to world's greatest mountains and highest peaks, and also the most important rivers. So that's what I'm going to speak about, the Tibet Plateau, and why it's important to us, and why we need to take actions, and why we need to put a collective effort. So today I'm going to focus on 4 issues. When it comes to Tibet's environment, there are many issues that we can focus on, but I like to focus on 4 issues at this venue. And number 1 is His Holiness the Dalai Lama's environment efforts for last 50 years. And then, of course, the global significance of the Tibet Plateau. Number 3, impact of climate change on the Tibet Plateau, which is very important. And finally, briefly, I will touch on the current environment situation in Tibet. Now, environment activism and environment movement across the globe at the moment is really big. And some do it for name, some do it for stage, but many of us do it because we really want to protect environment. His Holiness is one such person. His Holiness is someone who has been working on environment issues ever since he took political power in 1950s. When the environment issue was not a popular issue, when environment issue was not an important issue, but His Holiness, as a teenager, his love for environment, as any Tibetan, was immense. That's why His Holiness put on a lot of environment efforts on environment protection. So, His Holiness, in his 3 main commitments in his life, environment conservation is one of the 3 commitments. And then, in 2015, during the COP21 UN Climate Summit, we launched a successful campaign called Climate Action for Tibet. And during that climate action, His Holiness sent a video message, greeting and praying for success of that summit, encouraging people who work on environment issues. And this message, His Holiness said, "This blue planet is our only home, and Tibet is its roof. The Tibet Plateau needs to be protected, not just for Tibetans, but for the environmental health and sustainability of the entire world." This is very important. This is why I'm here, not because we want to protect Tibet just for Tibetans, because we want to protect Tibet Plateau because it is important for the whole of the world. It is important as I'll give, it will be clear as we go further in my presentation. Then His Holiness gave another written message last year at the COP24, for which I had the privilege of handling this written message to the party delegates at COP24. Some of you might have got it, those who have been to COP24 in Poland last year. And this message, His Holiness said, "When we see photographs of the Earth from space, we see no boundaries between us, just this one blue planet. This is no longer a time to think only of my nation or our continent. There is real need for greater sense of global responsibility based on a sense of oneness of humanity." That's right, ladies and gentlemen. When we speak on Tibet's environment, as His Holiness has said, there's no political boundary when it comes to environment issues. We speak on environment issues not to embarrass the Chinese government, but rather to protect Tibet's environment. Because if we are able to protect Tibet's environment, then we are able to provide generations and generations of younger Tibetans to enjoy the same natural environment that our fathers and grandfathers enjoyed during our Independence Day. And also, we want to protect Tibet's environment so that millions of Chinese tourists who flock into Tibet can continue to enjoy the beautiful Tibet Plateau. We also want to protect Tibet's environment so that billions of people across the globe can enjoy the beautiful natural environment of Tibet Plateau. Now, the second part of my presentation, global significance of the Tibet Plateau. This is important because this is one reason why we also go attend the UN climate summits to tell the world that Tibet Plateau is important. And we require equal attention like the world gives to the North Pole, South Pole, and other regions. Now, Tibet Plateau is called the roof of the world. And that many of you already heard Tibet as being called roof of the world. But it's important why it is called roof of the world. With area of 2.5 million square kilometers, which is almost 2% of Earth's land surface. So it's a massive landmass, standing at an average elevation of more than 4,000 meters above sea level. It is considered to be the largest and highest plateau ever existed in geologic history of the Earth. This is the reason why the world's highest peaks are found here on the Tibet Plateau. Because of its massive surface area at a very high elevation, Tibet Plateau is also home to 46,000 glaciers. This is important. Because of the presence of huge mass of glaciers on the Tibet Plateau influences climatic conditions across the globe, like North Pole and South Pole, which is why the Tibet Plateau is called Third Pole. Now, there's an interesting story about the term Third Pole. It was Marcel Kurz, a famous Swiss explorer. After exploring most of the European mountains, he wanted to explore more. And he went to the Himalayas and standing next to the Mount Everest in 1933. And seeing so much glacier out there, he said, this must be Earth's third pole. That was the first time ever the term third pole was used by someone. It was his friend Daniel Ferd who sponsored the early expedition to the Himalayas. In 1955, brought out a book called To the Third Pole, History of the High Himalayas. That's when the term third pole was first literally used. And in recent years, the Chinese scientists have been using the term third pole again. And also we have been using the term third pole again because it's important, because it is the third pole that requires equal attention. But for Tibetans, we always knew we were the most glaciated region on Earth. Because if you read any Tibetan history, we call ourselves land of snow, snowlanders. Tibetan Buddhists call snowland paradise, or in Tibetan we call Kanchenpa, Kanchenjung, Kawachin, which all means land of snow. So we always knew that we were the most glaciated land. And then, because of the glaciers, because of high elevation, Tibet Plateau also influences climate conditions across the globe. According to scientific studies, it is said that the timing and intensity of Indian monsoon depend on atmospheric temperature on the Tibet Plateau. Those of you who are from India here, like myself, we know that the monsoon in India has been unpredictable in recent years. That's because we are losing a lot of glaciers on the Tibet Plateau. It is also said by some scientists that the recent increase of recent heat waves in Europe is also linked to loss of glaciers on the plateau, on the Tibet Plateau. And it is also might be very interesting to some of you who are from Canada that some scientists have found greater the snow cover on the Tibet Plateau, warmer it is in Canada. So the importance of Tibet Plateau extends not only to the Indian subcontinent, but to Europe and to North America. And of course, Tibet Plateau as the water tower of Asia. Those of you who have traveled to Tibet must have seen the Tibetan rivers. We are home to hundreds and thousands of rivers. But those of you who have not been to Tibet but have been to any part of Asia, you are never far from Tibetan rivers. Go any part of Asia. Go to Pakistan. The two most important rivers in Pakistan, Indus and Satluj, both come from Tibet. The most important rivers in North India, from Indus, Satluj, Kanali, and Brahmaputra, all come from Tibet. Basically, the fertile Ganges plain in North India is fed by Tibetan rivers. Then they traveled to the Southeast Asian countries like Thailand, Laos, Cambodia, and Vietnam. The two most important rivers in those regions, Mekong and the Selvin, both originate from Tibet Plateau, and they are called mother of all rivers. And those, in the ancient times, people considered the rivers flowing from the heaven, like any other regions. So if that is true, then Tibet was heaven in the past. Now then, in China, the two most important rivers running parallel to each other from east to west, Yangtze in the south and Yellow in the river in the north, both originate from Tibet Plateau and flow across China. Basically, Tibettv River sustained Chinese civilization and economy. So, according to UNEP, more than 1.5 billion people directly depend on Tibettv rivers, and if any damage happens to Tibettv rivers, 1/3 of world population could be somewhere or other be affected. And then, of course, then the third part of my presentation, climate change and its impact on the Tibet Plateau. There are three impacts that I like to highlight. Number one, glacier melting. Because of the high elevation, the temperature rise on the Tibet Plateau is 0.3 to 0.4, which is twice more than global average. And which, because of rapid rise on temperature, Tibet Plateau has more than 82% of its glaciers retreated in the last 50 years, according to IPCC report. And there has been no net accumulation of ice on the Tibet Plateau since 1950s, which means there has been continuous loss of glacier on the Tibet Plateau. And if the current rate continues, then 2/3 of all Tibetan glaciers would be gone by 2050. Existing glaciers would be gone by 2050. Another impact of climate change is permafrost degradation. Tibet Plateau is covered by, 70% of Tibet Plateau is covered by some form of permafrost. And Tibet Plateau is, 50% of Tibet Plateau is grassland. This grassland, Tibet Plateau receives very little rainfall, but during the summer you see full-blown grassland. That's because the permafrost on the Tibet Plateau sustain and nurture the plateau. So any damage to or any loss of this, the permafrost would cause rapid desertification, and which is already happening in north and northeastern region of Tibet. And I want to highlight one particular incident. And you see a picture here. On September 7, 2017, there was an incident on a summer pasture where mud flowed down the hill like a lava. That's because of rapid melting of frozen ground underneath. And the weight of that, because the surface couldn't carry the weight, the melting ground flooded down the hill. And this is a clear indication of rapid melting of permafrost on the Tibet Plateau. Now then, of course, increased natural disasters. In the past, our grandparents used to say, natural disasters will happen only in China, but not in Tibet. That was the general belief that we Tibetans had. But in recent years, it was no longer the same. What used to happen in China is happening here in Tibet also. In 2016, we saw unprecedented number of natural disasters happening at the same time. During the 3 months of summer, we saw floods, glacier avalanche, drought. So that's when we wrote an article called Natural Disasters in Tibet, Is This the New Normal? That was the fear we had as environmentalists. We feared that the natural disaster that happened in 2016 might not be an isolated case, but might be a new trend. And we forewarned the Chinese government to put necessary measures to mitigate the impact. And one particular incident in 2016 is the Solo mudslide. So what happened was, because of heavy rainfall on the mountains, a mud flood happened in Solo in Amdo. And during that mud flood, it brought down wild animals along with it. This is unseen for the local Tibetans. This is a clear indication of severity of natural disasters in 2016. And in 2017, the pattern continued. And there had been more floods in the southern part of Tibet, mostly because of increased rainfall. And I want to focus on one particular incident, that is the Nyomda flood. So what happened was, because of heavy rainfall, the town of Nyomda saw the river that flowed through the town surged and flooded. And it destroyed a 5-story building and killed 3 people. And the local Tibetans said they have never seen such floods in their lifetime. And that's when we again wrote an article called Flooded Tibet, Struggling to Adapt to the New Reality. And in this, we again forewarned the Chinese government to put necessary measures and policies to mitigate the impact. And we said, and in the article we said, the recent floods could have been avoided had the Chinese government proactively pursued a policy of safety first in any infrastructure development in the Tibet areas. In 2018, it was worse. 2019, even worse. In 2018, we saw summer nomadic pasture flooded because of heavy rainfall. In 2019, recently, we saw heavy snowfall, which killed thousands of yaks and 1,000 more wild animals. So the impact of natural disasters because of climate change is obviously happening on the Tibet Plateau, and this is one area that we really need to focus on. And then final part of my presentation is current environmental situation in Tibet, and this I will focus on two issues. Number one, destructive mining practice in Tibet, and number two, looming garbage crisis in Tibet. Now here I will highlight two case studies. Number one, a mining happened inside a nature reserve. On August 16, 2013, more than 4,500 local Tibetans protested against a Chinese mining company. They were protesting for two reasons. Number one, the mining was going to happen on a sacred mountain. For Tibetans, mining on sacred mountains is simply unthinkable. If Chinese government knows something about Tibetan culture, they will never do it. Or if Chinese government has some respect for Tibetan culture, they will never do it, but they did it. And number two, Tibetans were protesting because the mining was happening inside a national nature reserve. The nature reserve was declared in the year 2000 by then Chinese President Jiang Zemin. And when they declared that the area as a nature reserve, they removed thousands of Tibetan nomads out from those regions. And what they said, they need to remove Tibetan nomads to protect the head source of three rivers and protect the ecology of that particular area. But what happened after 10 years? In 2013, Chinese government gave license to do resource extraction in that same area where Tibetan nomads were removed. And this clearly affirms the long-held fear that Tibetans had that the resettlement of Tibetan nomads is nothing but to make way for more mining on the Tibet Plateau, because Tibetan nomads occupy vast area, because we need summer pasture, winter pasture, different for different spots. And during this particular incident, what happened was 500 Chinese paramilitary forces were deployed, and they fired tear gas and rubber bullets. And because Tibetans were not violent people, but we were angry. So one of the Tibetans named Sopo Chukdu, as a protest, he stabbed himself. He could have gone and stabbed some Chinese, but he didn't do that. He stabbed himself as a protest, non-violent protest. And you know what he said when someone went to visit him in the hospital? This is what he said. I felt a sense of helplessness, as there was no one we could go for justice. That's right. Tibetans had no one to go for justice. That's why we people in the free world here have the responsibility to echo their wishes and demands. Then case number two, mining on a sacred mountain. On 31st May 2016, 2,000 local Tibetans protested against another Chinese mining company. They were protesting because the mining was happening on their sacred mountain, and it was happening for the last 10 years. And Tibetans have been protesting for the last 10 years. The pain caused by this mining in that particular region led to 3 self-immolations. Sri Tendup, age 34, Kunchu Tserin, age 18, both self-immolated on the mining site in year 2012. And third self-immolator, who self-immolated after a year. And in a letter that he left behind, he said, the agony caused by mining on the sacred mountain is one too much to bear, and it's one of the reasons why he has self-immolated. Now, sacred mountains are very important environmentally. There have been many field research done by scientists which affirms that Tibetan people's belief in the sanctity of sacred sites has greatly contributed to the environmental protection of key ecologically sensitive areas for the last thousands of years. And if we continue to respect Tibet's cultural way, respect Tibetan cultural attitude towards sacred mountains, then we will be able to protect Tibet's environment for many more years to come. That's what the scientific papers stated. Now then, finally, the garbage crisis in Tibet. This is an important issue to me personally, because I see this is an issue that is a crisis is beginning to happen. And if we do something now, it's manageable. If we left after 5 years, it would be out of control. So it's the right time we do something now. Now, when we saw many stories about Tibet, garbage problem in Tibet, we wrote an article called "Garbage Rampage in Tibet: Why Rampant Littering on the World's Highest Plateau Concerns Us All." And in this, we have again forewarned the Chinese government to put necessary management to treat garbage and collect garbage. But after a year, in the summer of 2018, there was an article called "The Litter Collecting Monk of Tibet," which was published on China Dialogue. And in this article, they have acknowledged the presence of a garbage crisis, but said the cause of this garbage crisis is primarily because of local community. So we wrote another article after a month and said the real cause behind Tibet's garbage crisis was because of the more than 30 million Chinese tourists flocked into Tibet. When they go back, they leave equal proportion of garbage in Tibet with no management to treat or collect or transport those garbage. It is Tibetan community-sponsored volunteer groups who collect this garbage from the mountains and from riversides to clean it up. So, ladies and gentlemen, I'm very excited that members of parliament from different parts of the hemisphere present here, and I really like to request you to put forward a few actions. And in 2015, we put forward 10-point call to action, and here I have highlighted 6. And to the United Nations and international community, we ask them to make the Tibet, to recognize the global significance of the Tibet Plateau, number 1. Number 2, the world must make Tibet central to any global climate change discussion. And number 3, scientific research must be launched to better understand both the impact of climate change on the Tibet Plateau and Tibet's critical role in reversing the effects of global climate change. This is 3 issues that I request you to highlight in your parliament, in your government, or wherever you could at international conferences. And then to the People's Republic of China. China's environmental law should be fairly and rigorously implemented across Tibet. Tibetan people's traditional knowledge and way of life should be respected and incorporated into environmental laws. And finally, the consent and views of the local Tibetans should be sought for any development projects in Tibet. If we are able to do this, then we are able to protect the beautiful plateau of Tibet that we Tibetans and the Chinese and the billions across the globe can enjoy and continue to enjoy. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. That was very educative. Now we have, I think it's a video, okay, of Professor Srikant Kondapalli, Chairman and Professor in Chinese Studies Center for East Asian Studies, Jawaharlal Nehru University in India.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, for the invitation. My apologies for the firstly on being absent at the venue, but through Skype, I would like to make a few points. Let me greet the honorable parliamentarians from across the world who are concerned about the Tibetan-related affairs. Firstly, I would like to say that many Asian countries are concerned in the recent times about the policy that China adopts towards Tibet. Because of the One China policy, many Asian countries are today feeling the heat. Secondly, with the recently launched Belt and Road Initiative, not just the Asian countries, as we gather, even Central and East European countries are facing the heat from China. Well, as you all know, and as the previous speaker had outlined, Tibet is on a high elevation, over 4,000 meters above sea level, and roughly constituting about 2 million square kilometers of territory out of the Asian landmass of nearly 44 million square kilometers. Tibet also has a population of roughly about 6 million people. But there are over 8 million Chinese who have been present in the Tibetan Plateau. In addition to what the previous speaker mentioned, over 30 million tourists who are bringing in about $7 billion of revenues. Of course, much of these revenues are going to the Han nationals rather than the local Tibetans. The GDP of Tibet is just over $20 billion as compared to $30 trillion in Asia as a whole and over $12 trillion in China. So the per capita income in Tibet is one of the lowest in China, with over $1,000 estimated, as compared to on an average of over $7,000 in Asia. So Asian countries are relatively positioned vis-a-vis Tibet in this format. But most significant from the point of view of Asian countries is also the resources that Tibet has. For example, the human resources, especially the talent that Tibetans have, is quite amazing. For example, in India, we have 10th standard, in the high school, the 10th standard results. Every year, the Tibetan students constitute one of the highest in terms of the pass or not, with some of the highest marks in the high schools. Secondly, there is also the nearly 200,000 Tibetans today are exercising democratic rights. They are voting in competitive elections, especially the last two elections. Very high percentage of voting is reported among the Tibetan community. In other words, the Tibetans are exercising their democratic right, voting choice. In India, we're right now going through an all India election campaign. The average voting here in India is roughly about 60 to 65%, as compared to Tibetans who are voting something like 88% to 90%. So there is something that we can learn from the Tibetans in terms of participation in the electoral processes. Secondly, Tibet is endowed with natural resources. As the previous speaker had mentioned about the water resources and minerals, over 100 mining sites exist in Tibet, which China is exploiting at a very faster pace. Secondly, the water resources, roughly about 25% of water from Tibet is passing to South Asia and Southeast Asia, as compared to near 28% of water resources into China. Over 10 rivers in Southeast Asia and South Asia are dependent on the glacier meltdown in Tibet. Of course, last 5 decades, we have seen something like 15% of the glaciers have melted down, creating a lot of concern for the South Asia, Southeast Asian countries. In addition, of course, China is diverting river waters. The South-North River Diversion Project, 2 of these projects have already been completed. And by 2050, China intends to divert something like 17 billion cubic meters of water, with huge concerns for the downstream countries like India, Bangladesh, Myanmar, Vietnam, Laos, Cambodia, and other countries. So in other words, the resources in terms of these water and minerals is posing a huge concern for the rest of Asia. There is, of course, there is the Asian countries in general feeling the heat about the One China policy. In this context, His Holiness the Dalai Lama had visited many Asian countries, but most frequently, apart from his sermons extensively in India, there are visits to Japan almost every year for the past, say, over a decade. His Holiness the Dalai Lama had also visited Taiwan several times in 1997, in 2001, 2003, 2009, and in 2015. Mongolia is a different case, which is, of course, predominantly Buddhist populated. When His Holiness the Dalai Lama went to Mongolia in 2002, China had blockaded the borders of Mongolia. In 2016, when the Dalai Lama visited Ulaanbaatar, China had increased the tariff across the landlocked Mongolian landmass, creating many hardships to Mongolia. Today, Mongolia had joined the Belt and Road Initiative. However, there is a certain debt that Mongolia is facing with the Belt and Road Initiative projects. His Holiness the Dalai Lama's influence is also quite widespread in Thailand, where a majority of the population is. Of course, the Dalai Lama had visited Thailand in 1993 to attend a congregation of the Nobel Peace Laureates. They were putting pressure on of another Nobel laureate, Aung San Suu Kyi, from Burma. The Dalai Lama had visited Indonesia a long time ago, in 1992. So, very few countries today are admitting the Dalai Lama's visit, even though these are basically religious meetings and sermons are given in this context. India has a certain model which I would recommend other countries to adopt. Number one, India had given refuge to the Dalai Lama in 1959. Today, nearly 160,000 Tibetans in India. Of course, India had accepted the One China policy in 1954, in 1988, as well as in 2003. In the official documents, India recognizes that Tibet is of China. However, today, India protects the Tibetan culture, Tibetan religion, Tibetan way of education, or other forms. For example, India never recognized that Tibet is a historical part of China. India also never recognized, never mentioned in its joint statements with China that Tibet is an inalienable portion of China. In other words, there are several caveats that India had forward, and today the Tibetan diaspora in India are free to conduct their own educational system, their own religious practices, or even their own political ideas. So to that extent, there is a lot of scope for other countries as well. Emulate the India model in terms of protecting the Tibetan culture, religion, and traditions. For centuries, we have had peace on the borders with Tibet. Since the People's Liberation Army of China went to Tibet in 1950, 1950, we have seen tensions between India and China. This is reflected in 1962 conflict. This is reflected continuously in terms of nearly 400 transgressions in the border areas between Tibet and China and India. So in the light of this tension, there is the Indian effort to preserve the Tibetan flame. For example, in nurturing talent, in preserving the religious and cultural traditions of Tibetans, India has been in the forefront. Secondly, India is in the forefront in encouraging Tibetans to exercise democratic rights. Unlike in Nepal, unlike in other countries, where there are restrictions on the electoral process for the Tibetan Parliament, there are no such restrictions in India. In other words, the Tibetans can exercise their right. So this is one possibly a message that other countries, including Latvia or other countries, democratic countries, will also propose and nurture. Thank you very much for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Kondapali, and he was exactly on time. So please, if there are any questions, otherwise we will take, please.
Thank you. Actually, I have a question for each of the speakers. For Michael, maybe you can explain how one can believe the genuine autonomy is feasible given the record of one country, two systems so far in China, especially in Hong Kong. And does it require really a change in the government of China to make everything that you're talking about feasible? And then for Professor Chen, the Chinese, is it true that you said that the Chinese people have no interest in Tibet or in Tibetan culture and religion, and at least I've been informed that given the spiritual crisis in China, the fact that you had a communist regime succeeded now by this very value-free materialism, that there is interest not only in Christianity but also interest in Buddhism in China. So isn't, at least in some parts of the population, isn't there an interest? And then for Professor Kondapali, maybe you could just explain to us what was going on last March when India canceled having this meeting in India, but also then moved the Thank You India meeting from New Delhi to Dharamsala. And was that an effort by India to appease China?
Please.
Yes. Yes? Very good. So the question is about genuine autonomy and whether it is feasible in the present circumstances. It's a very difficult question to answer, which is why it's a good question as well. A genuine autonomy, the way that this is conceived in the memorandum on genuine autonomy that the Tibetans crafted. If China were to end up, if Beijing were to end up accepting that, there is some chance that it would work. But that is because the genuine autonomy that is proposed is not an autonomy as conceived by the PRC in the way they've set up their system. Autonomy in the philosophy of the PRC is, in effect, a transition from of a territory towards assimilation into China. That's how they view the autonomy of Hong Kong. And that's why they only guarantee the autonomy in Hong Kong for 50 years, because the idea is it's a transition towards integration. And part of their argument for saying that the Tibetan proposal for genuine autonomy just is unacceptable is because Tibet is already on its way to being integrated. And so why would they give autonomy for it to become more far removed from China? So within the philosophy of the PRC and the PRC system, it is difficult to see how it could work. And for that reason, I think change is necessary, as you say. But the proposal that the Tibetans have prepared and have given them has to do with genuine autonomy the way that this has been experienced elsewhere in the world, where there are guarantees for autonomy, where the division of competencies or the division of powers is very clear between the center and between the autonomous region. In some ways, as this happens also in India, with special regions of India that have their own autonomy or special state status. So it's the guarantee part, it is the decision-making power and authority of the autonomous entity that makes it very difficult for the PRC to accept the proposal. And in that sense, I think in that sense there is a type of something confusing when it is said that all the Tibetans want is for the constitution provisions on autonomy as they exist today, or the law of autonomy as it exists today, to be implemented in the PRC. Because those provisions are built in such a way that they do not give Tibetans decision-making power. According to the constitution and the law on autonomy, autonomous regions in the PRC have less decision-making power and less autonomy than Chinese provinces in the PRC. And when you realize that, why would you then want to become an autonomous region or have the current system implemented? So there, I think one needs a little bit more clarity on that subject.
Thank you. Dr. Chen.
Okay. Regarding my question about whether Chinese people, they have interest in Tibetan Buddhism, I would say that, of course, yeah, given the, the ideological crisis in China right now, and many Chinese people, they resort to religion. And you see more and more Christians. And also, I believe that more and more people, they believe in Tibetan Buddhism, they show interest. But the problem is that it will be very difficult for us to get exact number. And what I say earlier in my presentation, based on my field trip to Amdo in 2011, is that I found that hundreds of Chinese tourists are taking photos in that area, but nobody really want to get into the temple to see what's going on inside. Nobody showed any interest in Tibetan culture, which really surprised me, because it's quite different from what I saw in Taiwan and also in India. And another problem in China is that the government wants to place every religion under control. And when people talk about religion, you place faith in front of state. And this creates a problem, because the Chinese government, they want all religions to be loyal to the government. And when people became very religious, and they don't believe this kind of thing. And so perhaps, yeah, that's the situation in China. I hope I answer your question. Thank you.
Thank you. Now, Professor Kudampali.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you very much for raising that question on whether there is any restrictions by India on the Tibetans. My answer is absolutely none. For example, the first World Parliamentarian Convention on Tibet was held in India in 1994. It is true that the Foreign Secretary of India had sent a circular that highest level officials should not meet the Dalai Lama or other major functionaries in the central Tibetan administration. This is a routine circular that every year they keep issuing. Soon after the circular was issued, there is the minister, Mr. Sharma, related to culture of the central government. He shared the dais with His Holiness, the Dalai Lama. So this is a public meeting in Dharamshala. So in other words, there are no restrictions nor any plans to kind of restrict the meeting. Thank you.
Thank you very
I think
much.
there is also, if I can add, Mr. Chairman, I think what the Tibetans enjoy in India is widespread civil society support. As His Holiness the Dalai Lama preaches across India, he is one of the more popular personalities in India. So, Parliament in Exile, the Central Tibetan Administration, the Dalai Lama, and other functionaries have a huge support base among the civil society. One of the aspects here is one other countries such as Latvia or other countries could learn is in a complex situation like this, when we accepted the One China policy, how do we still continue to support the Tibetans in preserving their culture? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And now we stop for a tea break, and we reconvene at 16:15. Thank you.